Yeah, thank you, Joey. Thank you for having me here. It's really, truly a pleasure to be here speaking about this topic that I um, really like and like sharing more about. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here. I see a number of familiar names from near and far in the participants list, so I appreciate your time. And hello as well to my mom. Thank you for being here as well. Hi, Mom. So yeah, looking forward to talking about critical information literacy with you all, sharing some key aspects of that idea and practice, and we'll have some time for reflection and Q&A towards the end. So let's get started. Um, First, I would like to share a bit about myself. I've worked as an academic librarian for 12 years, and here I am in front of my office. My current position is Head of Research Support and Outreach for Columbia University Libraries, and I am a white, straight, and able-bodied male, and that means that I benefit from pretty much every type of privilege there is, and from living in a society that is founded upon and oriented to uphold white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, and colonialism. I grew up in a supportive middle-class household and with parents who both received master's degrees and taught or did social advocacy work. In my job, I supervise 5 amazing subject specialist colleagues and provide programmatic direction and support for reference and instruction activities across their library system. And I also teach a class on information literacy in the Rutgers University Library and Information Science Master's Program, which is a lot of fun. And my full-time position has a considerable degree of job security. It has benefits and a reliable salary, and that allows me to be transparent with fewer risks than if I were precariously or underemployed. I want to also take a moment to recognize and extend gratitude to the indigenous peoples who stewarded the land we occupy, and to acknowledge this country's ongoing legacy of colonialism and exploitation. For those of us in what is today known as New York City, we are on stolen Lenni, Lenape, and Canarsie land. Attendees who are in New Jersey, southeastern New York, eastern Pennsylvania, and northern Delaware are also on Lenape land. The Lenape people were threatened, murdered, and removed from their lands through acts of violence by European settlers. Today, a majority of the original Lenape remain in Oklahoma as a federally recognized tribes of the Delaware Nation and the Delaware Tribe of Indians. Because we live on and benefit from these unceded lands, it is essential that white settlers in particular educate ourselves about the original stewards and make material reparations. And I encourage you to visit these links for the Manhattan Fund and the First Nations Development Institute to learn more and make a contribution, as I've done for this presentation. And here is what I'll be talking about today. First, a look at critical librarianship, which is the foundation of critical information literacy, and will provide some useful overall context, then a closer look at what critical information literacy is, and some examples of the many ways that it seeks to question our libraries, institutions, and how the world works. So to set the stage, let's talk about this term critical librarianship. I'm sure a number of you here are familiar with critical librarianship, and for others it may be completely new. And it is simply taking a critical view of the systems that produce libraries and shape their work, and then considering ways that the library can be made differently. So that's really what we're here today to discuss. How are libraries shaped by societal issues? How do they in turn reproduce them? And also, how can we take our everyday work practices, our ways of researching, established disciplinary ways of knowing, and change them so that they can challenge these same systems? So if critical librarianship sounds like it requires subversion, that's because it does. Right? So the term was coined in 2007 with Tony Samek first defining it here as a movement that puts the human condition and human rights above other professional concerns. And it's also worth mentioning here that progressive and politically conscious librarianship has a much longer history, with the Progressive Librarians Guild operating since 1969. There's radical reference and associated local chapters that have been in sporadic operation since the 2004 National Republican Convention in New York City, and many, many other grassroots and formal associated and affiliation groups that are working on various social issues related to librarianship. So what does critical librarianship stand for? This may feel like a cop-out, but it really changes, right, depending on the time, the place, and the person. So even for myself, it's, how I perceive and try to practice it continues to change over time. But that said, there are some core tenets that give form to it. And one of those is a commitment to social justice. Critical librarianship seeks to create a more just and equitable world and to disrupt white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And these goals, I should say, are present to a slight degree in the American Library Association's core values of librarianship statement. As one example, this statement describes the profession's commitment to things like social responsibility and diversity, but critical librarianship seeks to take things much further in order to challenge the way that things exist. And critical librarianship maintains that libraries are not and cannot be neutral. They never have been, and they never will be. And surprisingly to me, this is still a controversial statement, but it seems pretty clear. Libraries are made up of people and collections, and every decision and action reflects what we believe or value. So when a library worker buys a book, they choose one title among thousands of other possible choices. This book purchase puts money in the publisher's pockets. It becomes part of the library's collections, and there, alongside the many other books, becomes a visible, tangible manifestation of what knowledge the library prizes and promotes over other types. So there are countless other examples, some of which we'll get into, decisions that we make while cataloging or while enforcing policies or while making hiring decisions. But the takeaway is, if it involves a choice, it's not neutral. Here are a couple kind of case in points, I feel. So even so, shouldn't we try to be neutral, right, and try to represent all viewpoints? My answer is no. Apart from being impossible to accomplish in the first place, this emphasis on neutrality or seeking it just leads to both sides isms, as I think illustrated here. So there's the principle of neutrality, of equal opportunity offense, of seeking a non-existent political in between, which means taking the path of treating all perspectives the same, whether that's a white supremacist, an anti-trans activist, or another ideology that seeks to deny other people the right to exist. So in a neutral library, those who are already attacked and othered simply find another place that reflects societal oppression. And if libraries as organizations are actively fighting against oppression and supporting marginalized library users, then they're participating in it. So one more addition, and one question I find useful time and time again is who benefits? And I find it really helpful, especially for essentially any work efforts, especially like considering where my and others' labor is being directed. So for example, we spend a lot of time helping library users access materials they need, like the full text of articles or a copy of a book or troubleshooting database access, typical library stuff. While these are needs that patrons clearly have, my question is who ultimately benefits from our efforts as library workers? Essentially, we're smoothing out issues with highly profitable subscription databases that are difficult to search and use, or for publishers with restrictive and expensive ebook licenses. And I have to share one of my favorite chat reference interactions recently. which was a student who asked why an ebook was limited to one user at a time. Why would an electronic item have the same single reader restriction that a physical print book would? That was their question. And they understood the library didn't set these rules. They were genuinely curious, and the only answer is the vendor is maximizing their profits for shareholders, right? So I'll, say some version of that. And I'll also ask these questions working with students in library instruction sessions. So what topics are represented in search results, and why is that? Who is represented among authors of academic works in a given field? Why is that? What does it tell us about the subject? And the answers point to major issues in academic publishing and higher education more generally, but also when and where additional perspectives need to be located to really understand a topic. Okay, so with this background in mind, let's talk about critical information literacy, which is one offshoot of critical librarianship. And much like critical librarianship at large, it seeks to understand oppression as it's present within and perpetuated by libraries and information systems, and for library workers and learners to intervene in these systems to change them. Great, right? Sounds good. What does that actually mean? Well, let's first take a look at information literacy. This is defined as, very broadly, the ability to find, evaluate, apply, and communicate information. And the term was first used in 1974 by Paul Zurkowsky. It's an essential competency, he says, to ensure workers' continued productivity in the era of technology. And here's a first page from that report, right? It's today usually invoked in terms of combating disinformation or some other lofty aim like that. And in practice, day to day, it encompasses all sorts of activities, from acquiring knowledge of how to do a new job to finding sources to back up an argument you accidentally got in with your uncle on Facebook about politics, right? Lots of uses, and there are a lot of fascinating subfields of information literacy. There's embodied learning, which is the role of the body in sense making and acquiring knowledge. There's visual literacy, which is the ability to interpret and construct meaning from images and visual information. So there are at least a couple dozen other literacies as well. So why do we need critical information literacy? We already have so many literacies, right? I'd say this is because information literacy broadly and many related literacies really fail to account for how socio-political factors largely determine how we seek and receive and interpret information. So instead of taking our information environments for granted and working with those, it asks how they are constructed and could be changed. And critical information literacy urges library workers and learners to recognize and resist dominant modes of information production and dissemination and use. And this shift towards understanding libraries as reflecting and perpetuating dominant ideologies, never being neutral in the information they provide, is significant, I think, because it asks us how oppression functions in ways that often go unacknowledged. From a white heteronormative male perspective that represents a large portion of North American libraries' collections, to racial bias in how library users are or are not provided outreach and reference services. And critical information literacy also draws upon a wide range of ideas and inspiration, especially any theories that consider power. This can mean post-colonial theory, critical race theory, queer theory, political economy, lots of different possibilities. And of these, the field of critical pedagogy is most often applied because it relates directly to education, right? Critical information literacy is strongly informed by the educational efforts of librarians, but it's not limited to teaching, I feel, and it's instead a way of thinking about and critiquing information literacy as a whole. And Critical InfoLit also seeks to create meaningful and actionable learning for library users. And this is most often done by destabilizing and challenging hierarchies, as well as creating opportunities for dialogue, participation, and reflection. And one common goal is to demonstrate to learners that their voices matter and that they have the power to take action on social issues that impact them. And the underlying idea here is that when learners are actively engaged in their own education and see how what they're learning relates to everyday life, it has the potential for them to acknowledge their agency as active contributors to social and political processes. Okay, so very quick overview of critical librarianship and some key aspects of critical information literacy. I have here some questions that I hope will get us thinking about a few factors that are key to critical librarianship as it's practiced in work, in our research, and our activities. So I'd like to ask you to pick one of these questions, maybe two if you're feeling ambitious, and to take 2 minutes to think about it and write down any thoughts that come to you. So these will just be notes for your own purposes, and we'll have an opportunity to pause and think for a moment, and again, some time for Q&A at the end of this session in case you'd like to share any reflections that came up there. So think about a question, pick one out, write down some thoughts, and from there we'll move on to some examples of critical information literacy in practice. All right, great. Well, thank you for participating in that exercise, and thank you for contributing to the chat, John and Arjen. That's great. Interesting to hear. And I look forward to hearing any other thoughts that came up. But I personally always find it's nice to just take a minute to think about things during a presentation or otherwise, and situate that within what I'm doing. So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at some areas of critical information literacy in practice, and how it is and can be applied to various areas of libraries, library work, and education and research more generally. Library instruction is a major area of critical info-lit practice. And this generally means a librarian leads a class of some sort. It may be a drop-in workshop at a public library on finding news. It may be a single visit to an undergraduate class on biology. Maybe it's a semester-long credit-bearing class on research skills, but it's important also to point out that teaching happens in all sorts of ways, especially reference work, right? Like interaction at a reference or information desk. That's absolutely teaching, or research consultation, another form of teaching. So I'll share some major topics and methods for how critical information literacy is taught based on a research project I did, and highlight a couple of examples. So there are all sorts of ways to bring ideas into the library classroom, but these 5 themes came to the forefront in interviews that I did with librarians who practice critical info lit. And there's using classification systems as a way to think about the ideologies these tools reflect, using search examples that draw attention to social issues, examining how access to academic information is limited by publishers and regulated by processes like peer review, discussing corporate advertising platforms that call themselves search or social networking platforms like Google and Facebook, or alternative media like zines and small press publishers. So here's one interviewee talking about search examples, which are an easy way to draw attention to current events or even long-standing issues. And in this example, they used a gender wage gap as a sample topic for searching and finding sources, but there are lots of different ways you could do this, right? With a class for art students, we can use search examples on post-colonial artists and works, or we can see what research has been written on Renaissance nudes from a feminist perspective and how the male gaze, shaped art at that time. And these sorts of examples can be a way to get into further class discussions or activities around these issues and create more dialogue and awareness where there may not have already been before. And how something is taught is really, I think, just as important as what is taught. Critical information literacy prioritizes discussion and dialogue among students and the teacher. It uses group work as a way to decenter the typical classroom hierarchy and spark ideas. Tries to skip the usual database demonstration whenever possible. Finds ways to incorporate reflection into a session and seeks to formulate and pose problems that are of significance to learners, right, that are relevant to them. One major component of working towards critical consciousness, critical awareness, is engaging in dialogue. And this example talks about one way to move past just a demonstration of a database or library website and actually have learners involve themselves in a setting that I think too often sees them as passive receptacles waiting for knowledge, right? Having an activity where learners assume the roles of scholars in a field and consider who gets to participate in the literature, I think is a great example of involving everyone to make library instruction more personal and meaningful. And this helps to contextualize other fields as well. So again, if we take an art example and use maybe the Guerrilla Girls famous campaign about less than 5% of artists in the Met Museum's modern collection being women, then there could be a similar activity with students playing the roles of artists and curators and museum goers and trustees, probably, to illustrate the different perspectives. Right. So I'd like to also take a look at an area I feel is under-examined in critical information literacy, which is classification. So we like to focus on teaching and the educational aspect, but classification I think is fascinating. I think it's just so illustrative for, how it clearly demonstrates the biases in a given system, which, they make a judgment on the ways of knowing that are valued and determine how books are presented in library collections, but it also determines where these items end up in the library physically and how they are found by library users and if they're found, right? So it's such a clear example of where the rubber hits the road with the ideological, which is constructed and changeable, right? Shaping the material world. So I did want to mention for classification systems more generally, I wanted to plug Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences as a really great book on the topic. Sorting Things Out is written by Jeffrey Boker and Susan Lee Starr. It's a great read, but here we'll stay focused on libraries. And in libraries, we typically have one of two systems. There's Dewey Decimal System, otherwise known as DDC, and Library of Congress, which is known as LOC. And using these examples, applying a critical information literacy lens, what stories do these systems tell, and what do they choose to prioritize, and what do they choose to exclude? Because there's always going to be something, right? So Dewey Decimal System was first published in 1876, and I was floored to find an estimate from the German National Library that over 200,000 libraries in over 135 countries use Dewey, and more than 60 use it for their national bibliographies. And it's been translated into more than 30 languages. So of special note in this international context is Dewey Decimal is notorious for its bias towards a white, Western male Christian view of the world, which not coincidentally corresponds to its author, Melville Dewey, who is also a known sexual harasser, racist, and anti-Semite. And the issues with Dewey are certainly too long to list here, but just as one example, the slide lists Class 800, which has separate sections for literature in selected Western countries, and then there's one section for all other literatures, right? So DDC is revised periodically to account for patently harmful terminology or categorization, but the foundation remains the same. Library of Congress classification is used more frequently by large research and university libraries and originated from the need to catalog the U.S. Congress Library collection that Thomas Jefferson sold to Congress at 6,000 volumes, and it had grown to 1.5 million volumes at the end of the 19th century, at which point they were like, we need a classification system for this. So it was first formed in 1904. It is highly Eurocentric. It's based in Christianity, which is seen, I think, most clearly in the world history, history of the Americas, and philosophy, psychology, and religion sections. Unsurprisingly, LOC fails to take into account the perspectives and preferred language of marginalized people, and while the system is again continually revised, the process for making additions and revisions is cumbersome and slow, to put it nicely, I feel. This is especially clear when we look at certain subject headings. Sexual minorities is still the preferred term for LGBTQ plus topics and people. Indians of North America is still a preferred term, scare quotes, preferred term. Illegal aliens wasn't replaced until 2021 after years of grassroots efforts. It was originally slated to be changed in 2016, but then Congress intervened, and the terms that are now in use, aliens being replaced with non-citizens and illegal aliens with illegal immigration, are still very dehumanizing because no human being is illegal. So what is the effect on a person when seeing themselves described in harmful terminology, when they're required to use these terms to do research or to find books that interest them? Some libraries make local changes to their catalog to revise the worst terms, but that brings up other issues and challenges. And due to the changing nature of language and different perspectives on preferred terminology, the catalog can't be fixed once and for all. It just requires constant revision, and that's a lot of work as well. So here's one example of an alternative system. The WeWa library uses a locally developed system to organize its materials, and it uses a British Columbia variant of the Brian Deer classification system, which was developed in the 1970s by Kanawaki librarian Brian Deer. And you can see just how different this system is compared to one like Dewey or LOC, and that's largely because it's purposefully created with their specific context and their audience in mind, as opposed to seeking a universal system that's intended to apply to all things everywhere. Right? And to hone in a bit further on critical information literacy as a means of interrupting classification systems, here's a quote from another study interviewee who shared their creative classroom activity. And they asked students to look at library classification as anthropologists from the future who are trying to discern this culture's values. So, again, a library catalog or controlled vocabulary in a database, it tells us so much about assumptions and intended audience. So what knowledge is conveyed to be consequential? What is not? And if you look at any information system, then it'll tell you in great detail. So I want to talk about one more aspect of libraries, which is space, and a library's physical space and the things associated with it, from whether it's named after someone and for whom, to the paintings that are hung on its walls. Again, tell you an amazing amount of what institution prizes. So to look at library space, I'll use some examples from my workplace at Columbia University. The largest library at Columbia is Butler Library, and it's shown here around 1934 in the process of moving books from a former library location using a slide, which is, library innovation at its finest. It's well known for its facade, which features inscriptions which has the names of 18 writers, philosophers, and thinkers, including Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Milton, and other men representing the Eurocentric canon that makes up the core curriculum at the university. There have been multiple attempts to challenge the names that are inscribed in Butler Library. So in 1989, students attempted to hang a banner with the name of women writers, but were prevented by campus security. In 1994, students successfully hung a banner with 10 white women writers' names for Women's History Month, and that was sanctioned by the university for a short period. And then there's a Butler Banner Project, which happened just a few years ago. So this was a project inspired by these prior efforts to mark the 100th anniversary of the core curriculum with a new banner. Several students and library staff worked tirelessly to make this banner a reality, and then in fall 2019, the banner was unveiled, featuring the names of 8 writers and thinkers who were female identifying people of color. And to complement the display, the libraries hosted an archival exhibition and a series of events honoring the writers and the themes they discussed in their works. The banner was an intentionally short-lived but successful initiative because it generated this dialogue on how women and people of color are erased from and marginalized within academe and the university's curricula. But after 3.5 months, the banner was removed as planned, and Butler Library resumed its original facade, which I think is a convenient and material reminder that these longstanding histories will not easily be changed. So there's the building, and then there is the art within the building. In this instance, it reflects the same narrow view of what is deemed proper and fit for the university that the Butler Library facade also broadcasts. These works are produced by white men and depict white men. And again, you have to wonder and ask, what does this tell students about belonging, about their place within the university, and about their future contributions to the world? What does this signal to them? So 5 years ago, a student advisory group brought concerns about the artwork and to the libraries, and some small changes were made. There were 2 portraits from the university art collection hung outside of a popular study room. So on the left here is Dr. Hu Shi, who is the first Chinese-born student to graduate from Columbia. And then there's Winifred Edgerton Merrill, who is the first woman to graduate from Columbia, which is great. Love having them on the walls. They're welcome additions, absolutely. But this is a photo of the interior of the same reading room, which has 2 life-size 18th century portraits of the Prince and Princess of Wales under an inscription that says, "A man is but what he knoweth." So to me, even as a gesture acknowledging the contributions of people of color and women in the university's history, it's entirely inadequate, right? And applying a critical information literacy lens here, we know that libraries possess an array of symbols, whether that's signage or art or desks or, yes, books as well, right? And these symbols position library users in relationship to the institution. Many libraries seek to project this legacy and sense of importance, of endurance, and this is not coincidentally almost exclusively of a Eurocentric and patriarchal variety. So putting this into practice for library workers and library users in terms of space, I'm sure we can all picture the libraries we work and research in and can think of ways it could be made a more welcoming space. Simply in terms of accessibility, there are many considerations, just a few of which are listed here. And one question I ask first-year students in library instruction is, how does the library make you feel? And the answers are everything from anxious to bored to inspired, which, drives home the point that the way people experience the library is never monolithic. So what would your library look like if users had a say in what art was displayed or in what public program it offered? Since the library can't be everything to everyone, this is where taking a critical librarianship stance becomes essential, and that can mean working with library users to add underrepresented authors and topics to the collection, or inviting up-and-coming speakers to contribute a new perspective to a topic, and just generally using the library as a space for asking these bigger questions about libraries, information, and community. Okay, so what's next, right? Good question. I feel critical information literacy has an important role to play in today's information environment, but also we have to remain realistic. It is essential, continues to be essential to learn how to question systems and verify information while being open to other perspectives and not giving in to cynicism. And I'd say that's where critical info really shines as a way of thinking and doing in libraries. And going forward, drawing upon other relevant movements and contemporary theories will be essential. It's an important first step to draw attention to social issues through library work and research, but it's another to grapple with chipping away, day by day, at deeply entrenched power structures. And I think in this respect, learning the strategies of activists and what it takes to build movements can only benefit library workers. For me, I've learned so much from the labor movement, and that to truly challenge that which is exploitative and unjust, the only option is to organize collectively and to build shared power. And establishing an analysis of power closer to home within our workplaces is key to realizing critical information literacy's aims. Here's a final word of inspiration, courtesy of the great Angela Davis. So it's all about contributing our own acts of illumination and resistance on whatever scale and degree is possible based on a situation. We can be intentional about the roles of our libraries and institutions in so many different ways. And it begins with learning about histories and legacies of achievement, of displacement, of learning, of struggle that are a big part of our communities and workplaces. And it begins with bringing the assumptions and practices that constitute systems of oppression into plain sight so that they can be challenged and ended. So we do sometimes for questions, and we will please use the Q&A function for those, but also feel free to reach out to me directly by email. I'm on Blue Sky, which is a Twitter alternative after Twitter took a turn for the worse. So you can find me on there. And my presentation slides are at this link, tinyurl.com/CILFrick. And here I have some recommended reading, and I'll leave that slide up for a moment in case there's anything you'd like to jot down. But thank you again for your time, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions from you all.
Thank you so much, Eamon. That was really wonderful. It looks like we have 2 questions right now in the Q&A, so I will start with those. But just a reminder, if any other questions come up, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar to ask your questions. So the first question that we have is from Maria, who is currently in a library science program, and their class is discussing examples of works by Holocaust deniers and the issue of keeping these misleading materials in collections. So while acknowledging that these could provide use to perhaps academics who are doing research into conspiracy theories, what would be a solution from a critical librarianship perspective to not advertise to the general public, keeping these materials only in academic/research libraries?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Maria. It's very interesting, and that's a good example of these challenging issues that can occur in our libraries. So yeah, I think this is one of those things where a lot of contextualization is useful, and I'm thinking of as just one example, there's a long-term effort at my library to remove harmful terminology from the catalog. And there's not been an easy solution. And what we ended up doing, which is imperfect, but certainly one option which may apply to this scenario. Is we have a web page that is prominently featured and linked to in a few different places that is about harmful terminology and the way that things in the library collection are described. So it's a little bit of a disclaimer, a little bit of context, and basically says, we know there are things that we have in our collection that we don't agree with. We don't agree with the way they're described. However, it provides important information about these histories, right? So, and to also, contact us to talk about these things if you wish. So yeah, that's one approach which I think some libraries take, but it's a great question that I don't have a very definitive answer to. Mhm.
Thank you. We have another question from Emily, who's asking if you've received any pushback or negative feedback from colleagues, management, patrons, and any other stakeholders. And how do you respond to others' expressed views and actions that might conflict with the tenets of critical librarianship?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, sure. I've definitely received pushback or negative feedback. And I feel like that's a good thing, and it means that I'm doing my job, or at least doing my job the way that I think I should be doing it, right? Um, which is complicated, right? If I weren't in a position with multiple privileges already, things might look differently. For an early career librarian, I may not feel as comfortable speaking out on issues. You know, if I'm a racialized librarian, it depends, right? So, um, yes, I've received pushback, negative feedback, nothing that um, I've taken to heart, I guess. And it's been coming typically from either colleagues or patrons, but um, again, if I'm not getting pushback, it means that I need to try harder, is my kind of stance, which only goes so far, I understand. And as for how I respond to others' expressed views and actions that conflict with critical librarianship, this is something where I think dialogue is really important, right? So I have my own opinions on things, other people have their opinions. Um, that's fine, right? I don't have to agree with everybody. They don't have to agree with me. Um, in the workplace, this can play out in different ways, but it ultimately doesn't have to be a, hill to die on for every time, um, you know, someone says, "Ooh, I don't know about doing this," right? Um, you just have to kind of keep at it and do what you can do. But thanks. It is a concern. Yeah.
Thanks, Eamon. We got another question that was fairly similar to that. So I'm going to ask a question from an anonymous attendee. And that is, how do you get colleagues who do not care about educating themselves, do not care about social justice issues to care?
Great question again. Thank you. Well, you can only do so much. So that's one consideration. What I've found useful is looking for shared areas of concern. And that could be with social issues or with not, right? So thinking about my prior job where um, we didn't have a break room for the library workers, for anybody in the library. Um, but we needed one, right? We needed a place to eat lunch or just take a break. And it was clear this was an issue among many colleagues. We just needed to do something about it, right? So it's a silly example, right? But we were able to get enough support among colleagues with very different interests and commitments and job duties, and identify an issue that we all wanted to kind of take forward. And we got a break room. You know, it wasn't beautiful, but it was a break room, right? So, again, that's one possibility, but I think just again having these conversations with people, listening to them, um, and seeing where there are shared concerns about the library is or isn't doing, what what should be happening, um, in a broader sense, and going from there. And if there's no shared common ground, that's okay too, right?
Thank you. Okay, so another question that we have is, we are seated in a very privileged neighborhood in a landmark building, and many of our most frequent users are conducting research for-profit entities. Many of us who need the most support never even reach us. Many of those, excuse me. And our historical landmark status is often used to keep buildings like ours as they are, unwelcoming as they are. What other examples have you heard about, such as at other institutions, to rectify physical structures that don't reflect the values we'd like them to, or serve the audiences we'd hope to serve?
Great question. Yeah, it's something that's been on my mind as well. So I appreciate your asking. I haven't heard of any compelling examples, I guess I should say. There's a lot of maybe renaming buildings. Like at Columbia, there's a building named after a, slave owner. That happened. It was renamed to something else. Like, okay, that's something. Um, I guess we can call progress. But actually, for talking about the physical structures, it's I think another challenge, as I'm sure you've gathered from that portion of my talk about artwork in the libraries. There's really just so much more we need to do to have it remotely reflect our student body and not this, you know, dreamed up and also tangible history that Columbia has. So yeah, I don't know of any great examples, but my first place to go would be just ask the people using your building, ask them and see what would make a difference for them. Is it physical accessibility? Is it lighting? Is it more comfortable space? Um, Really, the possibilities are many. As we know, library buildings uh, aren't perfect. Um, so yes, I would ask the people using your building and that you work with, and go from there.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. And while we do that, I am just going to drop a link in the chat just for our program review form. So hopefully you're not distracted by that right now, but for those who attended, if you have if you'd like to share your thoughts on this program or any advice or what you would like to see for future programs, please use that link that I just dropped in the chat. And now another question that we have is how this might be similar, but what advice do you have for advocating for the methodology, especially if in an institution that doesn't support it?
Yeah, I think it'll be a matter of. I mean, I've been in workplaces that don't um, explicitly don't support, a critical approach, or in workplaces that um, say knock yourself out, just as long as it doesn't disrupt anything too much, right? Just as long as it doesn't actually make any lasting impact. So, your mileage may vary, but I think focusing on what you can do is great. And also looking towards other library workers outside of your institution if you don't have support there. Um, there's a lot of people interested in and excited about critical librarianship that you'll be able to find online or through the library literature. So that kind of creating a sense of community, for yourself is really important. And there are also library workers all across the country, especially at this moment, who could really use your support in terms of, book banning, of library board takeovers, of all sorts of really scary issues that are resulting in job loss, doxing, horrible stuff. So that's another option for getting involved in the profession in a critical sense, and really kind of addressing our many issues today, outside of where you may be working.
Thanks, Eamon. We're right at 5 o'clock now. You want to do one more question, or should we wrap up?
Yeah, one more would be great. And it looks like there's two questions that maybe have some overlap about critical race theory and the whiteness of librarianship, and of critical librarianship. So could speak to that. 452 and 453. Yes, so absolutely. Thank you for mentioning the whiteness of the profession, which is absolutely a fact, undeniable fact, and of critical librarianship. So I think that critical librarianship is definitely overall white as a subfield in librarianship, and that it's not because of critical librarianship per se, but it reflects the profession more broadly. So librarianship is white, and so this subfield is as well. Bringing critical race theory into the conversation, I think, is really important. And some people choose to skip the critical information literacy part, and focus on critical race theory, which is great. Truly anything that moves the dial on these issues of racism in libraries and in the profession and in the workforce is incredible. And so yeah, it's there are disagreements within these conversations, and because critical librarianship and critical infolit is still relatively new, um, there hasn't been a ton of, I think, time or dialogue for disagreements, but it's happening more and more, which is only a good thing, of the whiteness of critical librarianship being pointed out, of it being almost exclusively represented in the global north. But these things are changing. There's really great scholarship coming from Brazil and Latin America recently, on critical infolit. There's things continue to change, which of course is great, because we want that dialogue to be occurring and to question these assumptions that we have already embedded in this relatively new area.
All right, Eamon, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you join us today. And I just want to thank all the participants as well. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to join us and to talk about and to think about critical information literacy. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.